I don't know if there is a better passage that we could go through on the eve of Halloween than the passage we're going through today. Just yesterday in my discipleship group, one of our members shared of how he had recently gone to a haunted house event. I will not go to those, but I was happy that he did. I don't know if you like things like that, things that are designed to scare you. We don't even watch scary movies in our house. My wife can't handle it. They just stick with you too long. But the guys and I, we were talking, and we thought, how fun would it be to have a scare house based solely on Bible stories? And the more we thought about it, we kind of surprised ourselves with how many exhibits we came up with. A tank of floating dead soldiers to represent Pharaoh's army swallowed up by the Dead Sea. Animal bones snapping together, coming to life as they did in Ezekiel's vision of dry bones. Having a dark room where you walk through and you hear the roar of lions, and maybe you bump into something fuzzy. Ah! That would be awesome. Why has nobody done this? Maybe somebody has. You can have the sound effects of guys being eaten by the lions. That would be great. There's a lot of scary stuff in the Bible, isn't there? But few can hold a candle, or I should say a lampstand, to what we're going to see in our passage today. Go ahead and look with me at Daniel chapter 5, if you dare. I'm just going to give you a little bit of backstory of where this story takes place in the overall timeline of Daniel. I think it's pretty important for us to understand what has been happening. Where has Daniel been? This story actually comes towards the very end of Daniel's life. It's been about 70 years since he has been taken into captivity in Babylon. He'd only been a teenager at the time. He's now in his early 80s, about 83 years old. King Nebuchadnezzar has died after reigning for 44 years. And not only has he died, but more than about a quarter of a century, I think 23 years, has passed since Nebuchadnezzar has died. And Daniel is still in Babylon. 23 years since the closing of chapter 4, I should say. Which closes, remember, with Nebuchadnezzar finally lifting his eyes up to heaven. And more specifically to the God of heaven, and turning, I believe, to saving faith in God. I had somebody ask me this week why I thought that. And I wrote 2 pages of my sermon I had to cut out because I don't have time to go into it. But I will say that before Nebuchadnezzar gives this great proclamation in chapter 4, he says, closing of chapter 2, he gives the sacrifices, he gives everything that Daniel needs to worship God. You, make a sacrifice to God. End of chapter 3, this is the God of Daniel. In chapter 3, oh wow, that was awesome what happened in the furnace. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the God of them. But then in chapter 4, everything becomes personal. He doesn't talk about God in the third person anymore. Let me tell you about what he did for me. That is where salvation is. Not the theological discussion, oh, God is great, he's the Lord of heaven and earth. I think he said those kind of things before. Salvation came, we said, let me tell you what he did for me. I met the Holy One. That kind of language. Maybe we'll take some time to unpack that sometime, but I think that when we get to heaven someday, we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar. And man, that's going to be fun talking to him. Now, since Nebuchadnezzar, there has been a whole string of other kings leading up to our passage today, and most of them experienced very untimely deaths. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son, Amel-Marduk, or Evil Merodach. I don't know who names their kid Evil, but he is mentioned in Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings chapter 25. He reigned from 562 to 560. By the way, you'll notice that oftentimes these kings will have two names. And that's because they would change their name based on whatever god they chose to identify with at any given period of time. But it was Evil Merodach who released Jehoiakim from prison, gave him a place of prominence there in the Babylonian court, and so he does figure into the biblical record. Now, after 2 years into his reign, Evil Merodach is assassinated by Nergal-Shar-Ussur, or Nergal-Sharezer, or Neriglissar. Yes, I have practiced these. Okay? And that's his brother-in-law, who apparently was involved in helping Jeremiah to get released from prison. He reigned from 560 BC until he died 4 years later in 556 BC, leaving his kingdom to his little boy, Labashi-Marduk. But Labashi-Marduk is deposed during a priestly revolution. Conspirators get that little boy and they beat him to death. And then one of those conspirators appointed Nabonidus, a former priest under Nebuchadnezzar. They made him king in 556 BC, and he reigns until 539 BC. But Nabonidus has a problem because he's not related to Nebuchadnezzar by blood. And therefore, he didn't have a right to the royal line. And so from what we can gather, he sought to establish himself by marrying into the family, by taking either one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, or more likely one of his wives, one of his widows, to be his wife. Now, that woman that he took already had a son, and that son was Belshazzar, who was, through her, part of Nebuchadnezzar's line. And so Nabonidus, he marries her, he adopts Belshazzar as his own, but he still feels insecure, he still feels in danger, and so he flees to Arabia. He actually moves his place of residence to Arabia, across the whole Arabian desert. He separates himself from Babylon. And for 14 of his 17-year reign, he never set foot in the city of Babylon. Instead, he appoints his son Belshazzar to rule Babylon in his stead as his co-regent while he is in Arabia. Now, Nabonidus was actually captured. His army was defeated abysmally by Cyrus. And so he lives the rest of his life as an exile, leaving Belshazzar, his son, the sole, or adopted son, the sole ruler of Babylon. Now note, all this has happened between chapter 4 and chapter 5. And there has been a steady decrease, a steady erosion of the empire as it comes under lesser and lesser kings. Now Nabonidus, he seems to have been a very good king. He was very devout, he was very religious, even if it was to false gods. But he was a man of peace. He was a man of conviction, capability. Belshazzar is seen to be quite the opposite. He is morally decadent. He fails every qualification of leadership that you could think to test him with. Kind of like you should say on a resume, I recommend, or letter of recommendation. I recommend this person with no qualifications whatsoever. You can take that one of two ways. With Belshazzar, not a good dude. He's morally decadent, and we're just going to see what a cataclysmic effect that his reign had on Babylon. Go ahead and look with me starting at verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Now, if you think 1,000 is a lot, you need to know that this did not include all the attendants, all the servers, all the guards, all the wives, all the concubines, all the lower level officials. When you take those people into account, the numbers shoot way up. And lest this seem unusually extravagant, according to Old Testament scholar H.C. Leupold, who cites the ancient historian Ctesias, ancient monarchs were frequently known to dine with 15,000 people daily. Daily! Can you imagine? Archaeologists tell us that Ashur-Serpal II, in 879 BC, he threw a banquet that included 69,754 guests. How is that even possible? How do you do something like that? How do you feed all those people? Kitchen crew, listen up. Describing the dinners of the Persians, Athanasius says, in one passage, 1,000 animals are slaughtered daily for the king. These comprise horses, camels, oxen, asses, deer, and most of the smaller animals. Many birds are consumed, including Arabian ostriches, geese, and chickens. You really knew how to party. Being a king was a very extravagant thing in Babylon and in Persia. And the venue was also extravagant. I mean, this banquet hall, you know, it's been uncovered by archaeologists. We have found this banquet hall. It was 52 feet wide, 170 feet long. If you want some perspective on that, the entire main section of the White House in Washington, D.C. is approximately that size. So it's a huge, huge thing. And by the way, they've uncovered all these, plaster walls, so it matches the description that's given to us in the book of Daniel, of course. And so it's massive, it's huge. And so Belshazzar, he's throwing this magnificent party, and he wants this party to be special. He wants people to look at him, to look at his wealth, and all of his glory, and just marvel, man, that guy Belshazzar, he's really got it all, right? He's like a Matryoshka doll. He's just so full of himself. And the scriptures say that he drank wine in front of his 1,000 guests. And that was against normal practice during the time. Kings didn't drink wine in front of their guests, because they were supposed to be pictures of sobriety, right? That's why the Bible says it is not for kings, O Lemuel, to drink wine, to drink strong drink. Daniel came out of a royal family, right? Daniel was a royal. He lived in Babylon. He's offered wine from the king's table. He says, no, I'm a royal. He didn't say that exactly, but that's his mentality. I am a royal person. I'm a person of influence. And no, I'm not going to put my influence in jeopardy by drinking of the king's wine. And here we find a guy with very different morals who's willing, he's in a position of kingship, and he's still willing to drink publicly, which means he's plastered. Yeah. He and all his guests. Verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. And by the way, it was actually against protocol during that time for men and women to dine together. It did not happen. And any time that protocol was broken, it meant that there were horrific sexual practices that were taking place. And so what the text is indicating to us is that there was an orgy of debauchery that we cannot believe. And we have detailed information of these kinds of parties outside of Scripture. But even in Scripture, you'll remember that the story of Esther begins with Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, throwing this massive feast. He's got all his men there, right? And his wife Vashti is throwing a separate party for her guests, right? Because that's protocol. It's Persian protocol. He says, I want you to come show yourself off. I want you to parade yourself around. And she doesn't do it. It's against protocol. And I have some self-respect left. Thank you very much. I think we would have liked Vashti. Well, this is that to the 10th power. Belshazzar and his friends, they're getting drunk. They're losing their senses. They're beginning to engage in all kinds of immorality. And into that context, that hell on earth, Belshazzar wants to bring in and use the holy vessels of Yahweh from the temple into this banquet hall. Now, Babylon, you'll remember, it was one of the richest empires that ever existed. And much of its wealth, much of its gold was gotten by overtaking other people. You overtook other people. You consumed their wealth. Now, they had their mines and stuff and all that too. But when Nebuchadnezzar was king, he seized many of the possessions of surrounding nations, including Israel. He seized their men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And he also seized some vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, holy vessels that were to be touched only by the priests. They were to be set apart and used for the most holy worship of Yahweh. And yet, those vessels, they are seized along with the young men of Israel. They're brought into Babylon, into unholy land, under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. He's saying, this is symbolic. I'm taking these holy relics from your temple, I'm putting them in my temple, and it shows that my God is better than your God. And there the vessels sat for years, decades. You think of 70 years, right? They sat there in his temple until Belshazzar, as the light bulb goes off, and you would have hated him because he was a mocker, which goes with wine. Wine is a mocker. He's a mocking person, and he decides, in the midst of this context, I am going to mock the God of Israel. I'm going to show just how pathetically weak he is and how superior me and my gods are. And I love how God takes his... It's like Belshazzar throws down the gauntlet, and God says, I'll throw down my gauntlet. You want to fight? You want to do this? Let's do it. Verse 3. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Interesting to me. Daniel lists them in that order. It's like he's moving down the statue. I don't know. There's something there. I don't know what it is. I haven't found a commentator yet who's commented on that. But gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone. He moves down. And so we see that the very instruments of God were being used to bring praise to other gods. And it's this point that the cup of God's wrath is full. And he says, enough. And praise God when he says enough. And I think in our nation, we're waiting for God say enough. We're waiting for him to say that. And I find sometimes in my heart, I'm like, God, we need judgment. I'm not afraid of your judgment. We need to be judged. Please, for the love of God, please judge us. Please cleanse us of the evil the debauchery that is going on, the total loss of any kind of moral compass. It scares me. It says in verse 5, in the same hour, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. So, okay, they have found in the banquet where the king likely sat, okay? It's very likely that he had the lampstand from the temple behind him shining brightly because, of course, he wants to illumine himself, right? The hand appears. You should see it. I have a painting of this. You need to see it. It's gorgeous. Terrifying, too. But on the opposite side of this massive cavernous banquet hall, there's this huge wall, and the fingers of God are writing across it. And some people surmise that, plaster wall, it's very likely that the king would have had listed his exploits on that plaster wall, because that's what you did. All the things that made you great as a king, all your accomplishments. And it's interesting to think that God may have been just writing right over all this. I think David Jeremiah calls his commentary on this chapter divine graffiti. It's like, here I've created this beautiful mural of myself on the plaster. Look how great it is. Everybody can see it. And the fingers of God right on top of it. These ghostly fingers reach right out of the spirit world, right out of the throne room of heaven, and begin writing on that wall, just as they had done hundreds of years before this, on the very top of Mount Sinai, when the fingers of God wrote on the 10 Commandments, "You shall have no other gods before me." And so many more of the commandments were being broken too that night, no doubt. Verse 6. Then the king's countenance or his color changed. This was the fastest example of sobering up anywhere in history. Those cheeks, think about it. They're red with excessive alcohol use. They suddenly become white as a sheet. And it says, and his thoughts greatly troubled him, the greatest understatement in all of history. And then it gives us a description of just how troubled he really is. It says, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. The literal translation is the joints of his loins were loosened. He's insanely scared. He's out of his mind. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And yes, these guys are still around. They're of no use before, but they're still employed, of course, as useless people often are in high positions of government. And it says, the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple. Your translation may say scarlet. Better translation is purple. Fabulously expensive color in the ancient world. A symbol of royalty. And they'll have a chain of gold around their neck, which is a mark of high rank. And he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar was only second, right? He'll be third. I'll make you pretty much equal with me. You're going to be a king like me. I'm going to offer them royalty. Some grand prize. Be king for the night, right? Because his kingdom was set to fall later that evening. Verse 8. So all the king's wise men and all the king's Chaldeans could not put Humpty together again. All the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. And the whole time Belshazzar is just getting more and more afraid. And after their failure continues, the scripture says, then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed. So whatever blood came back into his face is gone again. Another sermon I need to do sometime is on faces. So interesting how many times in the book of Daniel it says Nebuchadnezzar's countenance was changed towards them. Somebody's face is changed. Here the face is changed again over and over again. That concept is deeply Hebraic and multifaceted. And here it means he's scared spitless. And his lords were astonished. But into this chaos comes the first reasonable person that we have seen in this whole chapter. And that's the Queen Mother. Mama comes. The queen, verse 10, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. And this was most likely Belshazzar's father's wife, because she's not taking part in the decadence. We know Belshazzar's wife and his concubines are there. They're participating in all this evil. She's not. She enters, and it says, the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. You can hear the sarcasm in her voice. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. Now that is a very clear indication that she was Nebuchadnezzar's wife, because she remembers what he had called Daniel. A holy man. A man upon whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. By the way, there's no word in Hebrew for grandfather. And so father can mean grandfather. If you want to address grandfather specifically, you can say father's father, but there's no Hebrew word for grandfather. So you always have to look at the context. And here it's grandfather. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. By the way, note how she praises him in every possible way. Every title, every good thing she could say about him, she says. She has an enormous amount of respect for him. And I think Daniel's God too, because note how she calls Daniel by his Jewish name. Isn't that interesting? It's like, no. He said, your king, Nebuchadnezzar, called him Belshazzar. So she has to kind of put that as a footnote in, but there's a man named Daniel. And at this word, Belshazzar has a glimmer of hope. He orders Daniel to be brought in. And where's Daniel been all this time? We're not sure. Somewhere along the way, he seems to have fallen out of favor with the Babylonian kings. Maybe that was with Nabonidus, or we don't know. But there are a number of indications in the text that he is no longer cool to have an office. First of all, Daniel was in a position of, if he was in a position of power, he would have been there at the feast. But he's not. Apparently he still lived close by because he got there pretty quickly, but he's no longer a leader in Babylon. In fact, he seems to have fallen out of favor so much so that Belshazzar seems to have to be told who this Daniel is. Isn't that so typical of nations that grow weaker and more morally decadent? The good people get pushed out of office. And the most inept, dumb, godless people get moved in. It's been said that the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. Daniel was one of those moral people that was pushed to the fringe because, as we'll see, he's one of those politicians that cannot be bought. You do not buy Daniel. He has integrity, he has principles, and he's not afraid to stand up for them. I like what famed London preacher Charles Spurgeon observed about Daniel when Daniel was later thrown into the lion's den. He said, it's a good thing the lions didn't try to eat Daniel. They wouldn't have enjoyed him, since he was half grit and the other half backbone. He's right. It's interesting that those kinds of people are always called on, though, when there's a crisis, when there's a mess that needs to be cleaned up. They're not good enough to be at the party, but they're good enough to call upon when things get dark. And this time was no exception. Belshazzar calls for Daniel. And it says in verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I just hate that, by the way. You want to slap the guy? Because Belshazzar addresses him not as the Daniel whom his father made chief of the wise men, but as the Daniel whom his father brought as one of the exiles from Judah. It's a very disrespectful way of addressing him. And he says in verse 14, I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, they've been brought before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I've heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And I love Daniel's response. He couldn't care less. Belshazzar had nothing to offer, and Daniel knew it. He'd already seen the writing. He glanced over. Ooh, yeah. That is bad. And Daniel knew all the royals are about to be killed systematically. What's the last thing he's going to want to do? Put on a royal robe. Put on a royal chain. He wouldn't have been bought anyway. But he knew, I'm sorry, everything's about to hit the fan. And so Daniel says, verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. I love Daniel. He's a true preacher. He's got to get his introduction first. He doesn't get right to the good stuff, right to the answer. He's got to do his intro. But he has a message because he's a prophet, right? He's not there to perform a parlor trick or just to interpret the writing. He's here. This is the meaning behind it. Because of the majesty that he, God, gave all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. God had given Nebuchadnezzar. Whomever he, Nebuchadnezzar, wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And there's the crux of the matter. Belshazzar knew the story of Nebuchadnezzar. He knew better, but he didn't listen. And we as a nation, we also know better. Our leaders know better. What amazes me about all this is, remember how we talked about how Nebuchadnezzar had been trying to assimilate Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah into his culture and the worship of his gods, right? Well, throughout the book of Daniel, we find that God is working what I like to call reverse assimilation. God is expecting those who hold Israel captive to obey his laws and statutes. Isn't that weird? Even though they're from a different people, they're from a different culture. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has been seeking to assimilate the Israelites into Babylon in order to worship himself. God is seeking to assimilate Nebuchadnezzar into Israel in order to bring Nebuchadnezzar into worship of him. And so there's this tension in and throughout the whole story. Who's assimilating who? Who has the ultimate say-so? God or the Babylonian king? And what's interesting is that even though Belshazzar is not a Jew, he's expected by God to adhere to his statutes, to adhere to his laws, even though he's not an Israelite. But Belshazzar hasn't. He's rejected it. He's given himself to idolatry. He's profaned the holy vessels of God. And so Daniel continues. It says, "And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know." Such a contrast to the proclamation that's given of God in the book of Daniel. He is the living God. You are giving yourself to things that have no life, no power. And I love this phrase, "And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written." And this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, I used to think this was some kind of secret language of God, But it's not. It's actually Aramaic, which is the language of Babylon. They're units that denote measurements of weight. Mene sounds like mina, right? Like the story of the 10 minas, which the faithful servant invested and grew while the unfaithful servant did not. He buried his mina. It's the same thing, mina. And then the next word, tekel, means shekel. So that's another unit of weight. Remember, Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 shekels of silver. And then you have upharsin or parsin, which is a half shekel. Think of something that's parsed. So it's cut in two. It's parsin. And so it's a half shekel. Just as Belshazzar's kingdom will be divided in half. So if you take these words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, it kind of reads like cup, tablespoon, half tablespoon. And so it's not that the king and the wise men couldn't read them, but they failed to understand what that meant for Belshazzar. Now, when you take those verbs with different vowels attached to the Aramaic consonants, because it's very much like Hebrew, you kind of add the vowels. If you attach the different vowels to the consonants, the sequence becomes numbered, weighed, divided. The Lord had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end because he had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. He had made light of God, and God had made light of him. And the repetition of numbered, mene, mene, numbered, it adds emphasis. It means this is happening. It is certain, unchangeable. And it also suggests that not only is this tearing of the kingdom going to happen for sure, but it's going to happen quickly. The time, the hour is upon you. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. I love how David Jeremiah writes in his book how when Daniel walked away, just let those things fall off. He couldn't be rid of them quick enough. I don't know where he goes after that. If he goes to his... I know what he did. He goes to his house and prays. That's what he always does. Deliver God's message. Going to go home, touch base with God. See, just wait out. Wait out the night. It says, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being 62 years old. Now Darius was likely a title for Cyrus, and he had a general named Ugbaru. And when Ugbaru came to Babylon, he found it pretty much to be impregnable. They had moats. They had walls 300 feet high, 70 feet thick. You don't burrow through that. I saw David Copperfield go through the Great Wall of China once. Oh man, that's pretty cool. That's a trick. They had the helicopter fly over, and he had secretly gotten the helicopter and all that. Getting an army through a wall like that, not happening. The Great Wall of China was breached, by the way. You know how that happened? They bribed the guards. Yeah. Babylon, the walls were so impregnable. The Persian army was closing in around them. Had probably been there for about 2 months. And they're partying away, relishing. As the people of Jericho, no doubt, we're safe. We're safe. They had enough food to last them for a few years. Their water supply was abundant. The Euphrates River runs right through Babylon. It divides it into 2 parts. But little did they know that abundant water supply, think about the living water being dried up. God says, you are morally decadent. I'm going to pour my life right from you. Ugbaru had a number of his men go upstream. They diverted the waters of the Euphrates River into an artificial marsh. They had men stationed ready around the city. He said, when it gets low enough, you wade in and you go under. So the men are waiting. They're waiting. And sure enough, they watch the water slowly go down as those waters way upstream are diverted. And then they crouch down. They wade into the water. They go right under into the middle of the city. They go right to the palace and they take it. Historians say that not a single spear was thrown. Not a single battle took place. That's confirmed in the Nabonidus Chronicle. Belshazzar was slain that very night, and the people of Babylon rejoiced. It seems that the Babylonian regime had become so unpopular, they actually welcomed Cyrus in as a liberator. Wow. That's how decadent Babylon had become, how awful Belshazzar was. It was better to have another nation come in and take over. Wow. One of the things that's so remarkable about this passage is that, as I said before, for months, the Persian army had been amassing outside the walls of Babylon. And we wonder, how could you be so foolish? I mean, if you think you're impregnable, fine, but my goodness, to make such a spectacle, to be so arrogant. The prophet Jeremiah wrote about 50 years prior to this, and he told exactly, step by step, almost, what was going to happen. I want you to listen to this. This is 50 years before it happened. He prophesied that a northern nation would conquer the city in Jeremiah 50, verses 1 through 3 and 9. He prophesied that this nation would be associated with the Medes in Jeremiah 51, 11 and 28. He prophesied that Babylon was described as a greatly fortified city, Jeremiah 51, 53. Fourthly, Babylon would be taken by a trick or a snare. It says that in Jeremiah 50, 24. Fifthly, he says the city's demise would involve the drying up of water. Jeremiah 51, 36. Sixthly, this would be accomplished while a great feast was in progress. Jeremiah 51, 39. Seventhly, there's got to be a 7. This would be accomplished when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was in power. Jeremiah 27, 6 through 7. The fullness of time had come. The cup of God's wrath was full. Then the Mene, numbered, it had come. You know, what was true of Babylon, I think, is true of us today, both nationally but also individually. God has always and will always judge any person who sets themselves against him and his written word. Ezekiel 18:20 says, "The soul that sinneth shall die." The soul that sinneth shall die. And this chapter is really a commentary on that verse. Sin will bring death in the life of an individual and in the life of any nation that chooses to live in it. And while you and I, we may never have stolen vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, at least I hope you haven't. It's kind of hard to do now. I've been there. There are many times that we have taken the sacred gifts of God and treated them as common. And that includes ourselves. You are the most sacred vessel that God has, and he cares about you. He wants you to be holy, to be set apart to him, just like those golden cups. I think God doesn't really care so much about the golden cups. I think he cares about his holy people in whom he has poured his very image. Who holds our breath in his hands, who gave us the breath. So many times we give ourselves over to things that are unclean. We, the sacred vessels that bear God's image, we've embraced sinful things. We've misused sex. We've abused alcohol. We've worshipped the gods of idleness, the gods of entertainment. All of us are guilty of the blood of the people that we should have stood up for and we didn't. And in so many ways, we have exalted ourselves, our own way of doing things, over and against God's way. And like Belshazzar, I think many times we allow ourselves to be lulled to sleep. Do you see the writing on the wall? I do. And it scares me spitless when I look at our nation. Because I know, wow, judgment is coming and judgment is coming fast. We are at the end. We are beyond the point of no return in many ways, unless God brings a revival like we have never seen before. Are we ready? Think of Cyrus kind of like Jesus. The people in the city who are living in all that hell, who weren't invited to the party, who are, I don't know. They welcomed in Cyrus as a liberator. Here's our Savior. Coming in from another kingdom, he's setting up house and we're being taken over. I'm not saying Cyrus was Jesus, but I'm saying that you and I also were waiting for another kingdom to break in. And it's a lot nearer than we think it is. And we need to make sure that when he breaks through, we're not clothed with the garbage of the world, with the royal robes of the world, with the chains of the world, with the titles of the world, with the moral decadence of the world, with a cup in our hands, drinking at the party. This morning, if there's anything in your life that you're holding on to that belongs to Babylon, I want you to give it to God now. And I want you to say, God, I shouldn't have touched that cup. It was not for me to touch. I'm sorry I went to the party. I'm sorry that I allowed myself to become assimilated into Babylon. But Lord, I praise you that because of the cross, you began working a reverse assimilation in me. And you have begun assimilating me into your kingdom. And Jesus, I'm willing to let go. And where I'm not willing, break my fingers. I love how Kinlaw writes that in his devotions. Just break my fingers if you have to. Help me to let go of Babylon so that I can embrace you in all of your fullness. Let's pray together.